All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. It's just the top of the hour here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Heather Grant. I am one of the community admins in the maintenance community by Upkeep. Thank you for being here with us today. If you are not already a member of the maintenance community on Slack, we would love to have you join us. I will add a link in the chat in just a moment on how to sign up. Today, we have Susan Lubell joining for a presentation on applying RCA to improve your business's bottom line. Susan is the principal consultant at Step Consulting, primarily focusing in oil and gas onshore, but more recently has gotten involved with mining and mineral processing. I'm looking forward to learning a lot and a great presentation with Susan. The recording from our session today will be available in the Maintenance Community Slack group tomorrow, along with a copy of the slides that you see here today. Susan herself is also available to answer any questions you may have in the Slack group. So please feel free to share the recording of this webinar as well as the invitation to Slack with friends, colleagues, or anyone you know who would benefit from hearing some of Susan's expertise. My last piece of housekeeping, and then we'll go ahead and get started. You'll notice that your cameras and microphones are not turned on today. So what you'll want to do to ask or answer any questions of Susan is use the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen there. So go ahead and send your questions through in the chat box, and we'll set aside some time at the end of our presentation today to go through anything that comes up. If we run out of time or anything like that, any questions we don't get to, we will, of course, answer offline in the community. So be sure to ask away and stay tuned at the end for a Q&A. That is it from me. Thank you again, Susan, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for making time today. And Susan, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Heather. I appreciate the warm introduction. Today, thank you so much for joining us. What we're going to be talking about today is root cause analysis made simple, and it's really about applying root cause analysis techniques to improve your business's bottom line. Many times, maintenance staff are so busy fixing problems that they never get a chance to prevent them. And root cause analysis is really about driving into understanding why we're having problems to evaluate and prevent those equipment failures. And it enables a safe workplace by reducing those unexpected failures. So what are we going to talk about today? First up, we're going to start off with what is RCA, and then we're going to talk about the 4 steps. So really quantifying the magnitude of the problem. So why and when, how do we go about performing the analysis and who should be involved? We're going to talk a little bit about how you develop and evaluate options. And then at the end, we're going to talk about documenting and implementing those recommended actions to drive that business value. I think one of the first things that we really need to understand is, what does root cause failure analysis mean? And simply put, it's really a class of problem-solving methods to eliminate the recurrence of the failure or to manage the consequences of a failure if it occurs again. When it's done correctly, it really discovers the true causes of failure, so we can put those corrective actions in place and get them implemented. So it's a step-by-step logical approach based on facts. And at its fundamentally, it assumes that every equipment failure happens for a number of reasons. And there's sort of a definite progression of actions and consequences that lead to that failure. There's a wide variety of excellent systemic methods out there, and all of them are predicated on the belief that problems are best solved by attempting to correct or eliminate the root causes, not just merely addressing those immediate or obvious symptoms. So if we can get our corrective measures aimed at our root causes, it's hoped that the likelihood of the recurrence will be minimized or ideally eliminated. Okay, so sometimes it's not possible to completely eliminate the probability of failure, and that's why we consider some failure management policies to manage the consequences to a tolerable risk level. Okay, so I think we've talked a little bit about what is root cause analysis now. I think one of the fundamental takeaways is really that unexpected equipment failures aren't normal and shouldn't be tolerated. We need to do something about them. As I said, there's a number of very excellent commercialized methods out there. You do not need a piece of software, although it does help for the documentation point of view. But really, if you follow any of the methods from start to finish, you'll end up at the same answer. So first up, from a business perspective and driving the bottom line, why are we investigating? Any failure that results in an impact to the health or safety of somebody on site or the public in general must be investigated. As far as I'm concerned, that's non-negotiable. So if somebody got hurt or our public outside of our plant site had an impact, we need to do an RCA. When we start to look at the other when we start to look at the other types of failures, when we start to look at the environment, and I took that photo there of the waterfall out in Banff, Alberta, Canada, we need to also look into anything that will have an impact on our environment, our clean water, our drinking source, or release into this. Okay, so one of our key business drivers is generally meeting or exceeding any environmental regulations and meeting the expectations of the public, of our landowners, any of our regulatory bodies. And not to mention, there's a real distinct cost and reputational risk of cleaning up our environment if there's a spill. So we've talked health and safety, we've talked environment. Next up is our production repairs. Often, if we have a failure, like the one you can see there on the engine failure there, this has cost a lot of money in terms of labor, in terms of parts, all of these sorts of things. And so there is the immediate production repair cost that's usually borne by the maintenance department. But our next failure or our next cost generally has to do with production loss. Sometimes if we're particularly in upstream oil and gas, or we're in a manufacturing and our process just gets slowed down and the raw materials get held up, but they can be produced later, this is viewed as sort of a non-issue. Production's really deferred. However, in a business environment where our expectations and our commitments to our stakeholders, that lost production can really affect our success in operating our business. One of the key things that I like to think about, and one of the key ratios I tend to use, is 0.1% throughput, okay, is about 9 hours a year. So if we have single train operation, fully loaded, so no spare capacity, okay, we have 365 days times 24 hours a day is 8760. If you have an environment where you do not have any redundant equipment, okay, and a fully operational facility there, 8760 hours, about 0.1% of that is 9 hours a year. So if we think about that, what is the throughput of your plant or your production facility? What is that 0.1% throughput worth to you? Okay. So often we see if we have a failure, it could take 12 hours, could take 24 hours, those sorts of things. That starts to have a significant impact on the production from our facility. Often get asked, when do we apply reliability methods like RCA? So we've understood so far RCA is really related to performing some sort of analysis, but now we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by failure? Most of you will have seen the PF interval. I'm not going to help you out by teaching it today. However, one of the things that we're looking for, we've got time along the bottom and we have condition along the y-axis there. Most of you will have seen this. This PF interval is really our maintenance repair window. This is when our PM program that we've got in place, the condition monitor we're doing, all of those sorts of things start to tell us that we have a failure that's imminent and we need to do some sort of maintenance intervention to restore the functionality like new. The time for our RCA is really after we've hit functional failure, and more frequently happens after we've hit that total failure period. Okay, so our old definition of failure was that equipment failed when it was broken. This is no longer the case. However, if we're still experiencing failures after we've got a PM program in place, or they're happening more frequently than we had anticipated when we set up our PM program, there is an ideal opportunity to perform an RCA and figure out, did we miss something in our PM program? Did we miss a failure mode? Have we not accounted for all the mitigation factors? It's really important for us to understand that RCA, by its very definition, happens after a piece of equipment has failed. Frequently asked, who should participate? Okay, so there's a couple of things that go on here. Generally, we have, say, 5 to 6 knowledgeable people. Sometimes it's a smaller group. It's not always the supervisor who's involved with this. It really should be people who are closest to the event or are highly familiar with how that equipment operates or is maintained. So if we generally see, if it's a piece of rotating equipment, our team usually consists of a millwright or a mechanic, the operator. We might have a rotating equipment engineer or a maintenance engineer involved, plus our facilitator. If it's, we've got the mechanic or the millwright who pulled apart that machinery when they're starting to do the repairs, okay, perhaps that millwright plus another one who has worked on similar equipment could be a great resource for bringing together some concepts or some ideas on how we bring this together. So one of the big things is to understand what actually happened, not what in theory happened, not what we hope had happened, not what the procedure says to do, but what actually happened. Often there's changes in operating conditions, adverse effects, all these sorts of things. So it's really important that this team is made up of people who are quite knowledgeable around the piece of equipment and around the operating context and the environment around it. Okay. Helps when your facilitator is highly knowledgeable on RCA methodology and familiar with the piece of equipment or with the general concepts. If you're in a more complex failure, you probably don't want your facilitator to be the technical expert on that particular piece of equipment, because they'll dismiss some of the ideas that could actually lead you to coming up with the proper root cause. They need to be highly familiar, but it helps a lot when you've got the knowledgeable people in the room. If it's a more simple failure, 2-3 people sitting down side of a desk, it can take an hour or less to conduct a proper RCA. Which leads me into the next one. How? How do we go about doing this? So this is a picture of an actual RCA, and that is my arm. So when we start to look at this, the first place I always start is a timeline or a sequence of events. So this is really asking ourselves what happened. And the activities are the events that have happened. And so we just list them all down. Our event is that the piece of equipment failed, and we're starting to look for supporting evidence. Typical things we might have seen. I'm in Canada, so we get a lot of issues with pieces of equipment breaking due to weather and freeze up. So supporting evidence, somebody might say it's cold, and I'm going to look on Environment Canada's weather network, and I'm going to be checking what is the actual temperature. Cold could be, it was a hot sunny day in the summer and we hit 15 Celsius. Okay, that's 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold in the winter means it went to -40, and it doesn't matter if you're in Celsius or Fahrenheit, and it's legit to having something freeze and forming ice, which expands. Okay, so we're always looking for those activities, and our failure event is that that piece of equipment broke. And we're looking both upstream in time and downstream in time for what might have been going on there. Okay. The sequence of events is really useful for straightforward problems that have a known sequence of events, or a lot of complex problems where combinations of root causes exist, and we've got to sort of figure out how we're going to break the chain. A bit of a hint there, whether you're doing this on brown paper with stickies, you're doing it on a whiteboard, one idea per sticky there. Or you could be doing this in a software program like Visio or PowerPoint or any of the whiteboarding tools, because you generally move the stickies around a whole lot because somebody will remember something. oh, I heard this when I was standing at the northeast corner of the building. Well, that was just before this came off from this reading, or we saw an upset here in our plant operation. And you need to be able to move things around. When we look at this particular example here, a few things happen on the 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th. But boy, our event date of the 3rd, a whole lot of things were happening there at end of December, okay, and early January. So we want to start to look at that when we're moving forward. Next up, one of the more simple methods that we use when we've got a straightforward linear program is often called the 5 whys. So our event happens, so something breaks, or we the performance drops off, but generally it's predicated on a piece of equipment has gone into total failure. And this method really works on the principle that if we ask why 5 times, so technically between about 4 and 6, it'll help you figure out the root cause. And it's really used a lot for linear, fairly straightforward problems. We have our event, we ask ourselves the failure mode, why did this event happen? And then we say because. And we ask ourselves, why did this cause happen? And it's because. And so we're going through cause and effect until we come down to the root cause at the end of the day. If we have a more complex failure, what we start to look at is something called a logic tree or a fault tree. And this is just an example. I just wanted to show you what it looked like. Fundamentally, we've got our failure event up here at the top. In this case, it's an actual piece of pressure piping that cracked, loss of containment. And when we came down all the way through it, this actually was an ice plug. So this is from a real failure. It is the one that had the sequence of events on the earlier page there. But we started looking and we came up with 6 plausible failure modes. And we started looking for evidence. And the key thing here is that our failure event is sort of a straightforward description of the loss of function. It's not the cause of the failure itself. The line below is really where we've got our potential failure modes. And we ask ourselves questions like, how could that failure mode or cause have occurred? And so you start to look for educated guesses based on what's happened in the past, or things that have known to been happening on similar pieces of equipment. And then what we're really looking for is data and evidence to prove or disprove that hypothesis. Okay, if the hypothesis is proved out, think of it, most of you might remember CSI, so Gil Grisham, and he said the data and the evidence will speak for ourselves. Well, similar to a crime scene investigation, this is our equipment scene investigation. And we're looking for data and evidence. When we have something which was a plausible failure mode and we've disproved it with data, we put an X through it. If you don't put this on your failure tree, people start to think that you didn't do a complete failure tree because you haven't ruled it out. So I always like to leave those failure modes in, but I also document where the evidence is that proved it was not that. Okay. And we keep going down and we keep asking ourselves over and over again, what were the physical causes? What were the decisions that people made? What were the latent and underlying root causes that would lead towards this particular loss of containment in this particular example? Okay, so we need to make sure that when we go from our physical root causes to our human root causes, that we don't stop there. People don't want to participate if they think that the outcome of a root cause is going to be pointing fingers and blaming a person. The whole point of those questions is really to identify and understand what business practices or systems contributed to the actions or decisions made by that human being. Okay, and this is really driving us into our latent root causes. So we're going to see both our internal and our external business policies, practices. Sometimes it's procedures, guidelines, job plans, systems. There's a whole lot of different sources of information. Sometimes our latent root causes include training, skills verification, those operating procedures, maybe time pressures, maybe the drawings weren't up to date. Maybe we didn't understand what the scope of work is going in. There's all these different hold points, inspections, and procedures. So it's really important for us to not blame a human, but to continue to drive down into what information was available at the time to make those decisions. When we get to a place where we think we've got the root cause, we put a circle around it. Now, if we're in a really complex failure, sometimes there's more than one root cause. You're going deep enough down to the point where you can actually figure out an action or an activity that you could do. Remember, our goal is to prevent recurrence or minimize the likelihood of a recurrence or minimize the consequence if it does recur. Okay, it's not to get down into the nitty-gritty of all the inside, the Wheatstone Bridge inside of the black box if our normal mitigation plan will be to change out that particular controller or that particular part. Okay. The main difference with a logic, fault tree, and failure tree is we need to understand whether we have ands or ors. Simplest way, I can't see any of you to explain it, would be kind of like the fire triangle. You need not only a combustible material, you need oxygen, and you need a source of ignition or a spark. Okay. Unless you have all three, you can't actually have the issue of a fire. Same thing here with our logic or fault tree. Sometimes one by itself isn't enough to result in that loss of containment failure. But if we have two or more trees happening, we will end up with a failure. Next up, I brought this up a couple times, the concept of quantifying risk. One of the most important things that we have to do is understand when we're not only investigating failures, so which ones do we investigate, but also when we're going to put together some potential options, what does it mean in terms of risk? We talked at the beginning about health and safety and the environment being really key drivers for why we would always investigate a failure. Sometimes we are willing to live with a light bulb burning out or things like that. The likelihood, yeah, it happens reasonably often, but the impact is fairly low. And so we may choose not to do an RCA on that. It's important to understand which failures are you going to investigate and which ones are you not going to bother. Generally, the companies that I have worked for and with choose to investigate everything that is moderate and more severe. So moderate, serious, major, and catastrophic. And they've got different categories for what to do about the low ones. Remote, low likelihood of it happening, very remote and low impact, we don't usually bother. Your organization is going to make its own decision based on its risk matrix of what does it mean to decide what threshold are you going to investigate at. The other place this comes into is identifying and evaluating options to realize your business value. Okay, so once again, this is from an actual root cause analysis, and we came up with 10 different recommendations. So we looked at the impact and the effort for the various potential solutions to address the root cause. In terms of effort, most organizations have their own definitions of high, medium, and low. Frequently, when we're seeing effort, something that could be accomplished by one or two people, less than, 24 hours, so less than 3 working days or less than a week, often gets categorized as low. Something which involves more than one team working together might take a couple of weeks to put in. requires a few sign-offs and things like that, might be a medium. Whereas a high level of effort generally involves capital projects, not just your maintenance or reliability team, but operations. Capital projects may need to get multiple engineering teams involved or lots of system changes. That would be categorized as high effort. So multiple groups involved and takes a long period of time. You may even have to go to the regulator. In terms of the impact, we need to understand high impact. We believe and forecast forward that it really is going to prevent that particular failure from reoccurring or take a big step change in mitigating the likelihood of it happening again. Okay, so low, medium, and high again, you're going to need to decide which one makes sense for your organization. You don't have to solve all the root causes and go ahead with every potential recommendation to prevent every root cause from happening again. As you can see in this particular case, we chose to implement recommended action 1 and 8. Okay, fairly low effort, got done in a couple of days, high impact for preventing that recurrence of that particular failure. When we've covered those off, low dollar value, so not only time, but low dollars to implement from an effort point of view, then we start to look at the ones that have high impact, but might be a little bit more complicated to implement. So in this case, numbers 3 and 6. Then we're going to move back over to the ones that are that have a medium impact, but low effort. Remember, you don't need to resolve every cause to prevent recurrence, but it's really important to actually implement the recommended actions. Just because we come up with a recommended action and write a work order for it doesn't mean it's always going to happen. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. We need to follow through with those recommended actions. So that leads us into our next slide, which is really about implementing RCA to drive business value. And that's the reason that you've logged in here. So let me walk you through this one. So up here at the top in the center, we have our company scorecard or our organizational scorecard. Every for-profit, not-for-profit, municipal, for-profit company that I've ever worked with over my career has got targets and goals on a scorecard. Generally, they're related to health, safety, and the environment. There's one or more around cost management, and there's another one around production. Okay, whether it is however many liters of clean drinking water your wastewater and water treatment plant is producing, or it's however many liters of soda pop your manufacturing is production. We have an event that happens, okay? And so we recognize we have a failure event. And what happens? Everybody rushes in to see what's going on. Sometimes it's a chronic failure, so something that's happened more than once, and we know exactly how to fix it. Okay. Sometimes it is a big chronic or a big sporadic one-of failure that's nobody's seen before. But regardless, we have this event that happens. And then we need to decide what events are investigated. I like to call that my RCA throttle. And this is really where we come back to our company risk matrix there. And we usually have decided which ones are investigated. One light bulb going out, probably not going to investigate. Something where somebody gets hurt, we have a consequence of a release or a spill. Yes, for sure, we're going to investigate those. Do we have a threshold around production loss? Do we have a threshold around how many dollars it costs to repair? All of those sorts of things. At that point where we're starting to look and we've got our event that happens, a lot of people are rushing in to try to troubleshoot and get the equipment back up and running. It's important to think ahead whether or not you're going to be doing an RCA. If you are, do your best to preserve the parts and the data and the information that you have. If you choose not to pursue the RCA, you can always dispose of those parts later, or the data that you downloaded from your plant operational system, okay? But if you discard them in the rush to get that equipment back up and running and later decide you want to do an RCA, you've lost the opportunity to capture that data, the broken piece of equipment, or any of the operational history. Okay, so if you're just getting started, sorry, I'm slightly off topic here. If you're just getting started, capture all of the parts and the data right away when that event happens. I have no illusion that it's all going to be shut down and waiting for you to come in with your RCA investigator hat on. People are going to get that equipment back up and running, but it's important to keep the data. Assuming that the failure event makes it through your throttle and is something that you're going to investigate, we're going to conduct our investigation. As I said, we're going to go through, we're going to conduct our investigation. I would suggest you start with a timeline sequence of events, even if it's really quick and you just write it down on a piece of paper while you're standing out there. What happened first, then what happened, then what happened. We may choose to go with a 5 why. We may choose to use a fault tree or a logic tree. If you are in an environment where there's a lot of familiarity with the fishbone or the Ishikawa, there's all these different methods, but we choose to start to investigate. And we come up with some quality recommendations that go against those root causes. And then we evaluate and we prioritize those recommendations, just like I showed you on the last slide. Now, the key part, we have now spent time to investigate. We have looked at all of the options. We've gotten people involved. We've taken a look at those broken parts. At this point, our recommendation is a dusty binder on a shelf, or worse, a lost file on somebody's hard drive. Okay. The business value that's associated with preventing the recurrence of the failure or mitigating the consequences of failure won't be realized until you implement some of those recommendations. I have seen way too many that have the work order created for the next turnaround and it gets lost somewhere and never gets implemented. That could be 2 or 3 years away. Not only do we need to implement those recommendations, we need to confirm that we receive the results that we expected. Our return on investment comes from getting those confirmation that our recommendations worked and were successful to prevent that failure from happening again or to mitigate the consequence. Okay. For those of you who are working in shops with Lean Six Sigma, this is going to be fairly familiar to you as the DMAIC cycle. Could also be the PDCA cycle, Plan, Do, Check, Act, or DMAIC, Define, Measure, Analyze, Improve, and Control. Okay, it's the same sort of thing. It's a continuous improvement loop. And this is really what drives our business value, is making sure that we go through all the steps as we go around. I'd like to open this up for some Q&A here. I always find when we're going through this, it may jog your memory, some questions around how do I get started, those sorts of things. So I'd like to open it up for Q&A. And I'm going to see if I can look over at our questions in the text chat. Okay, I see one question here. It says, sometimes it's impossible to eliminate the faults because you need to redesign the process completely. Yeah, that is true. Sometimes it's really challenging to eliminate the faults. However, where I see this is that rather than being able to eliminate them, that's why I said sometimes we can mitigate the risks, mitigate the consequences of a failure, or reduce the likelihood of the recurrence. Okay, so if we take the learnings from our RCA and we use that to feed back into our PM program, we may not actually be able to prevent every single failure from happening again without a full redesign. But the chances are that with our PM program, with our enhanced condition monitoring, we can use the RCA outcomes to feed into that, to decide, what am I looking for? Where on my PF curve am I? Are there other techniques that I could use to give myself a longer window through the PF interval so we can prevent that, the consequences of the failure, even if you can't stop it from happening again. We see that a lot. Some equipment is simply going to wear out because it's in contact with your process fluid. Okay. However, our RCA can move it way back and use that to give us a longer PF window. Sorry, I'm just flipping over. If you see me looking, it's because I'm looking at the text chat here. It's not that I stopped staring at you in the audience. Using a 365-day operational days, no budget for maintenance is already a fail. Maintenance budget time is necessary, and that's why there is a design redundancy. Neil, I think that depends a lot on what industry you're in. For many of the industries that I work in, there is not a redundancy built in. There is only one main pipeline, or there is only one main reactor vessel. They're too big and they're too expensive. So I 100% agree with you. Design redundancy in terms of having a second pump or having other equipment like that, totally, that is ideal situation. But the reality is that there are some very large or very expensive pieces of equipment. We also see this with conveyor belt systems where there is no redundancy built in. The other thing we sometimes see is that when a plant was designed, perhaps it was designed with two pumps with the idea that one would be running, so our duty pump, and one would be our hot standby spare, which we could flip to in the event that there was a problem with the initial pump or we needed to do maintenance because the impeller's worn, kind of normal things. Reality is over time, people got used to running both of them there. And so when you have to take a piece of equipment down for service, okay, which is perfectly normal to have an impeller start to wear out, you are into a reduced equipment function, okay? We're not really on the topic of root cause analysis here. However, what this is really talking about here is how root cause analysis fits in with your maintenance operating context, okay? So we got to think of this as one tool in our toolbox, okay? So we will have our maintenance programs, whether it's called PM program, asset maintenance strategies, asset care strategies, lots of words out there for it, as well as our root cause analysis. And together they sort of form a Venn diagram to give us the best overall production. Keep people safe. So safety of our workers, health of our workers, safety and health of the public, look after the environment, and then we start to look at our production and our economics. Okay, I've got one. I have to use RCA at the end of the life cycle of the machine, but how do I know when to start? Okay, usually we use RCA all the way through the life of the piece of equipment, particularly when we have failures that we are not expecting or they're happening more frequently than we anticipated. Okay, and so the life cycle of the machine, that PF interval, I would encourage you to go, and there's lots of resources, go look up how that PF interval works, because an RCA at the end of the life cycle of the machine, it may actually be an expected failure. There comes a point, I work a lot with slurry systems, where you just know that impeller is going to wear out on that pump. There's not much point in doing an RCA if you already are anticipating that failure and you know what's causing it. It's generally due to erosion from a slurry service. So I would encourage you, Dennis, to go look at the life cycle, to go look up that PF interval The Upkeep's had a couple of presentations on that, and there's a lot of other resources, and use that to balance out when to start tackling your RCA. Okay. Let's see. We have a question here around HAZOPs. HAZOPs are usually done, hazard and operability assessments. These are usually done at the design phase. Okay, so before the piece of equipment got installed. As I said, RCA is one tool in your toolkit, but it's not the only one. And you generally use those HAZOPs right up front when you're doing the design. And we start to use our maintenance programs, including RCA, during the operate and maintain phase of the life cycle. So if we go back to our asset management life cycle, when upfront we create capacity during our engineering and design phase and our installation or construction phase, and then once we've commissioned it, we're into our operate and maintain phase, where our maintenance folks create capacity or by creating availability in our equipment, and our operations teams use that availability to collectively, ops and maintenance, produce our product. Okay, that's where our RCA fits in. Okay, we've got a question here from Henry. How do we determine the best tool to use? I think you're referring to which one of the RCA methodologies to use. I think for myself, I always start with a sequence of events. I've always done that regardless of whatever tool I'm using. After that, there are quite a few different methodologies out there. Your company or your organization may have a preference. I am very much, what would you call it, methodology agnostic. I can go flip between a whole lot of them. I find that whatever one of the major methodologies that you decide to use, as long as you follow the questions all the way through to the end, you will still get the same answer. Okay, so when you're just barely getting started, I would start off with a timeline, the sequence of events. Often things will pop out and you'll say, hey, I just noticed that. We've got a pattern. This happens every 3 months, and look at what else is happening around it. Okay, and then what we can start to move into, if it's a fairly simple failure, you may want to consider the 5 whys. If it's a much more complex failure, once you've built up confidence and competency in investigating the smaller, more straightforward ones, any one of the major tools will work for you. Okay. A question from Ahmed here. They do lots of RCAs, but the failures keep repeating or happening. How to advise on avoidance or reduction? Okay, if your failures keep repeating, despite doing RCA, the chances are you have either not found the root cause or you haven't implemented the recommendations. I've been on a couple where we came up with these great recommendations, as I said, and somebody said, oh, we're going to implement this on the next turnaround. Well, if the next turnaround is 2 or 3 years away before we're going to implement that, we're going to have failures in the meantime. So I'm wondering, when you're doing your RCA and you say the failures keep repeating, either you haven't actually found the failure mode. Okay, so I would go back and I'd look at your failure modes and see if there's something that you missed. Perhaps you need to get other individuals involved who aren't working at your site, but perhaps work at a similar site, who may have seen something else as a potential failure mode, or even go and talk to the manufacturer of your equipment and ask them what's typical. I would go back and I would also start looking at your PM program, and I would ask, what failure modes are you attempting to prevent or to identify through your existing PM program, and see whether you've missed a particular failure mode in your PM program. Do I ask about missing things? Yes. I know Heather mentioned that the presentation is going to be recorded, and she's going to look after sending it out to all of you. I believe she said by tomorrow, so you might have to wait 24 hours, but Heather's going to send that presentation out for everybody to look at. Henry's asking about, is there a one-size-fits-all method for conducting an RCA, or do you keep changing methods? I think from my perspective, the methods are similar, but we do need to understand the complexity of them and the failure being investigated. If I showed you that logic tree or the fault tree that had multiple branches, really, if 5 of those branches don't exist, 5 of the 6 don't exist, we're really now back into a 5 whys analysis, aren't we? So I generally like to start with a timeline. I think it helps get everybody's mind, if you're facilitating, on the right spot, and it helps you gather in all the information. Much less threatening if you ask, what was the weather like? Where I was standing in the southeast corner of the building and I heard this whooshing sound is very different when you're putting it out on a timeline sequence of events. Often we notice patterns, seasonality, something that happens every 2 or 3 months. I did one and we discovered that it had to do with the alignment to the wash water cycle in a heat exchanger in the cleaning cycle. We would never have figured that out for this downstream pump if we hadn't gone back and started looking at what else was happening and how often it was happening. So Henry, I would suggest you always start with that sequence of events. After that, I would suggest that my personal view, I always leap into a logic tree. And if I have eliminated a couple of those failure modes, it really does come down to a fairly simple, almost like a 5 why, as I'm coming down just one branch of that tree. Okay, Dennis says his questions have been answered. Okay, so Ahmed's asking about experience and practice and expertise should you do to become an expert. I think for myself, I don't know if there's an exact number, but I think that practice makes perfect. Just like learning to play an instrument, the first time you pick up that guitar, the chances of you playing a song perfectly are really slim. Okay, so for an RCA, I think to gain expertise and confidence in it, what we really should do is start with a whole lot of the smaller, simpler ones. So get your mind around it, start to think about it. I have done so many of them now that I can't even start or look at an equipment failure without starting to think through in my mind, gathering the evidence. So scope out what actually is the failure mode or the event that what the failure event is that I'm trying to investigate, and start looking at those failure modes. And then I start to come down those trees. I can do this in my head now. But having done a lot of these, okay, you build up confidence, you build up capability and competence as you practice them before you get into the really complex ones, okay? So I think it's really a mindset shift. And as I said, it's one tool in your toolbox. So I think that you need to also start to think about, how does RCA fit in with the other reliability type work that you're doing? And once you start to get that failure mode concept in your mind, it just sort of spirals, and you start to use that, whether I'm developing an asset maintenance strategy or I'm going through on an RCA. So I can't give you an exact number, but it's a lot of them. 5 isn't going to do it. And they just start building up over time.
Awesome.
I think that's all the questions that I see, Heather.
That's everything I saw as well. Thank you for moving through those so well. I hope that everyone enjoyed the presentation itself and then got their questions answered or learned a little bit more from that last bit there as well. I actually had one question. I'm not quite sure how to format it, but you mentioned human reliability as a factor that can kind of throw off any logic tree, and it's difficult to kind of pinpoint in the thought process of analyzing a failure just because of its unpredictability or its difficulty to kind of trace down exactly why someone did that. What would your recommendation be, for including human reliability as a component in these types of failures, and how does that maybe add or subtract to or from the business case, if that makes sense.
I actually think it's pretty much on a complex failure, it's always a factor. And I think the big thing with it is that we can't use those human causes to pinpoint and blame somebody and risk people feeling that their jobs are threatened or they're going to get fired or ridiculed or anything like that. I strongly believe everybody goes into work every day to do the best job that they can. And what we have to ask ourselves is, what decision did the human make at some point in time? And we have to ask ourselves, what information did they have available? It's not fair to go 2 weeks later, comb through all this data, create all these graphs and charts showing all the different things that were happening, and then go back and blame a person. We have to ask ourselves at 2 o'clock in the morning, when the operator or the millwright made that decision, what information did they have sitting in front of them? And if that isn't sufficient information for making a good quality decision, then part of our recommendation from that root cause analysis is get them that information. They should be able to pull out a procedure that's correct and not have to guess at the torque value, not have to wonder which spare part am I supposed to grab out of the warehouse. Sometimes we see middle of the night, somebody grabs something from the warehouse and it turns out to be the wrong metallurgy. That's not that person's fault. That job plan really should have specified what metallurgy or what part number or things like that. So I think we need to use that, what the decision that the human made, okay, and ask ourselves, what information did they have? That will drive us into these latent root causes and encourage us to find a useful solution and recommendation, okay, that will prevent that failure from happening again. If it turns out it's because of dissimilar metals, the solution to it could be having my mechanical engineer figure out what the metallurgy is and put the right part number on my work order. And that, as I said, low effort to implement, one person, okay, updates a document with the appropriate bill of materials number, very high impact to prevent that failure from happening again.
Cool. Yeah, that's something that I find super interesting. So just wanted to hear your thoughts about how that kind of comes into play here.
I honestly think everybody goes in doing their best effort every day. And so we need to set people up for success.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, really interesting. I really appreciate your presentation, your time to answer some questions from the audience and myself. Thank you again for joining. I think that's just about all today. As I said, I will send the recording in the Slack tomorrow, but it actually does become available to watch at this link right after we end, and it takes a minute to process. So you'll be able to rewatch it soon or follow along with the slides tomorrow. That's all for me. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much for participating, and have a good day.
Thanks, Susan. I'll see everyone next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.